spaces that offer greater freedom. Yet even on the road to utopian frontiers, there continue to be trade-offs, barriers to free will and self-determination. While the West did not have the same histories of Black enslavement as did the South, the African-American Westerner remained an ambivalent figure to a certain degree. She was not so much an individual as a representative for the mass and majority, a notion that unleashed the white supremacist fear of a Black planet. The public sphere, locations of labor, educational settings, and housing were some of the arenas that continued as nodes of friction to full engagement of Black citizenry, even in California and the paradise of Black Los Angeles. Such examples show us how the uneven, asymmetrical, or patently malicious and unjust application of spatial logic informed experience and expression. Spatial theory in the writings of geographers, philosophers, architects, historians, and art historians help us see migration and segregation not just as arenas of social and historical movement and juridical challenge, but as the articulation of spatial structure, what Henri Lefebvre has called social space. Through it, we can see and understand how people shape their worlds through creative force. The question for us here is, how do artists translate the same experiences into form? What do they make of this world? How do they transform what they find into what they would like it to be? How, in the words of Elizabeth Gross, do these things become the measure of life's actions upon them? How does art speak in the spatial world that artists and others create of their lives? And how is the spatial imperative seen in life's physical peregrinations and directions found in this compromise between mind and matter, the point of their crossing one into the other that place represents? According to Lefebvre, social space is a social product. It is at once a field of action and a basis of action, quantitative in its expanses and qualitative as a depth of thought, material in its physical articulation and material in the work that it does. Social space is the penetration of real space as a material thing, with space as mental construct and philosophical iteration. If for Lefebvre space is a container of social relationships, art historian Mi Wang Quan sees space in the site specificity of art of the late 20th century as constructed of divergent forms, both material and immaterial. For Quan, site is simultaneously phenomenological, a physical iteration of practice, and social and institutional in its conscription of bodies and imbrication in structures such as museums. However, it is Quan's sense of site as discursive formation that is perhaps most intriguing, and like Lefebvre's social space, threads itself through all types of spaces, concrete, ethereal, as well as those of memory. Here, the notion of site shuttles between that of a physical location, grounded, fixed, actual, to a vector that is ungrounded, fluid, virtual. Catherine McKittrick offers another significant and related framing of spatial thought, that of the socio-spatial. If all knowledges are geographic, she argues, then positionality is geography. In other words, what do you know, and from where do you know it? McKittrick thinks about Black geographies and bodily ownership. She considers the history of Black people demarcated by discourses of possession and captivity of the flesh, occasioned by its attachment to the material fragment of the auction block. Because the Black body historically is an object owned rather than a subject that possesses, it is ungeographic. Black is rather a concept that is cast as a momentary evidence of the violence of abstract space, an interruption in transparent space, a different all-body answer to otherwise undifferentiated geographies. McKittrick's project is a consideration of respatialization of Black as body, as form, as geography, and ongoing mapping as a site of contestation and complexity, rather than dispossession or peripheral schema. It is located within and outside of traditional space, elucidates Black social particularities and knowledges from a spatial perspective, and ultimately offers a new and expanded understanding of moment space. Between 1960 and 1980, the art scene in Los Angeles generally, and certainly among African American artists, became a vibrant, engaged, and activist community. Works tied to traditional media, painting, drawing, print, sculpture, gave way to dematerialized post-minimal installation and body-centered performance. Within these styles and formats were spatial ideas that changed how artists accessed and incorporated notions of history and virtuality, the real and the imagined. While these ideas were present throughout the period and used to varying degrees, earlier works, not surprisingly, evidence of greater interest in history and didactic formulas, with later production moving toward the abstract and ephemeral. Made from Chinese ink on illustration board, Charles White's General Moses Harriet Tubman from 1965 is a portrait of this important slave absconder, conductor on the Underground Railroad, abolitionist, and Union spy during the Civil War. In White's 4-by-5-foot drawing, Tubman, the composition's center of gravity, sits on a boulder as if taking a brief rest from the task at hand. She stares out at us with a direct, relentless gaze. The artist takes on history, American, African-American, and also diasporic, in a commentary on transatlantic slavery. In fact, White's mode in the 20 years prior to this work was in the social realist vein, representing and repositioning African-American figures as subjects of accomplishment rather than the inhuman and unhistorical empty vessel that the label of slave suggested. Centered on a solid rock, Tubman's geographic presence belies the attachment to the perch of the auction block. The drawing was created the year the Voting Rights Act was passed, which dismantled impediments to black enfranchisement in many parts of the United States. The 1965 Act and White's piece both mark the centennial of the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. Taken together with its realist mode, the didactic and pedagogical nature of the work seems evident. This is one of my favorite photographs. Charles White's career brought him to Los Angeles in 1956 after he made a name for himself in his hometown of Chicago as well as New York. He came to the city with an international reputation, one that made him one of the most important African-American artists up to that period. The public profile of California black artists in the 1950s was largely defined by their commercial work. William Pajot designed men's ties. Betty Brown, later Starr, and Curtis Tan ran a successful jewelry and decorative arts business, Brown and Tan. There they are. Melvin Edwards worked with ceramicist and home accessories designer Tony Hill. White was part of a generation that willed an African-American art community into existence with little traditional art world support, mounting exhibitions in homes, community centers, churches, and black-owned businesses, cutting a path for the emergence of a cadre of professional artists. His mentorship of younger artists would prove to be a catalytic force, helping to sustain a vibrant black art scene in the city, especially after he began teaching at Otis Art Institute in 1965. Trained in interior and furniture design and fine arts at Chouinard Art Institute, Noah Purifoy also held a master's degree in social work. And from the 1950s into the early 60s, he worked at hospitals and social service agencies and in the commercial arts sector. He began his career as a cultural worker, however, as the director of the Watts Towers Art Center. Newly designated as a cultural heritage monument in 1963, the Watts Towers began to be developed as a cultural hub as a way to engage the community, attract attention, and support the project of its preservation. Its mission would be to address problem youth by using the arts as a tool of cultural uplift, which at once demonstrated art's value and the good works that Watts Towers itself could perform. Purifoy had the perfect credentials for the job, and it allowed him to combine his interest in art and social work. The Watts Rebellion of 1965 occurred a year into Purifoy's tenure as director of the Watts Towers Art Center and some 4 blocks away. He contended it was the rebellion that really made him an artist, allowing him to find meaning for himself and for African-American communities through art making. As Purifoy remembered, he experienced the rebellion, the destruction, the looting from the back door of the center. He and colleague Judson Powell, while the debris was still smoldering, ventured into the rubble like other junkers of the community, digging and searching, but unlike others, obsessed without quite knowing why. By September, working during lunchtime and after teaching hours, he had collected 3 tons of charred wood and fired molded debris. While Purifoy recorded some of his earliest work as collage, he was eventually drawn to assemblage, or assemblage as I like to say many times, because of the accessibility and availability of materials, because it was made from discarded things. In his eyes, such junk was democratic. It didn't discriminate against those with fewer advantage or access to art materials because it was free. Assemblage also had a relationship to narratives of poverty. It reflected communities ravaged by a social system that cared little for them. The rebellion and its remnants could be turned into not only something of beauty, but something of African American life. Here was the transformative aspect of Purifoy's practice, a way to transfigure the perception of one's living space, use what was available, and create something meaningful and beautiful. For Purifoy, the found object also represented a useful tool in mental health practices. It was a method to address trauma, a simple solution that Black or poor people could use. Using his own experience as a voracious reader, in the early 50s, while working as a social worker in Cleveland, he tried using what he called bibliotherapy, giving books to the mentally disturbed as a tool in their healing. With art, he found more success. Purifoy's use of art as a tool of psychotherapy, a way to reintegrate the mind and body, mirrors that of Ligia Clark of Brazil, whose object making also led her to a similar practice during roughly the same period. In spring 1966, Purifoy launched the exhibition 66 Signs of Neon, composed of junk art from the Watts Rebellion. It toured the country through 1969. Its goal was to communicate the human potential of Watts to the neighborhood itself and the world. As Purifoy explained, the show's purpose, quote, was to reflect the Watts Rebellion on a symbolic level and to demonstrate to the community an existing fact. If the community of Watts found itself in the midst of something like junk, value could be placed on it to far exceed the few cents paid at the junk stores on Monday